We resume our studies in the book of Nehemiah as we come to chapter 4. So please, if you can, open your Bibles at this point in the Bible. The best time to discourage anyone who has resolved to do something is immediately after they've decided on the new course of action, and when the initial excitement has begun to wane. The enemies of God's people are always well aware of this. Thus, the people of Nehemiah's day soon found their enemies active against them, as we see especially in the first 4 verses of this chapter. Though the opposition was only words, it was still a searching test, not least because Nehemiah's enemies were quick to point out the apparent realities of the situation. Notice then what they said. First of all, they emphasized the weakness of Nehemiah's community and highlighted and contrasted this with the past glory of God's people. Secondly, and linked to this, they stressed the fewness of their numbers. Thirdly, these same enemies also questioned God's ability. While finally they highlighted some of the immediate problems and difficulties that Nehemiah's friends had to face. These were only words, but how powerful words sometimes are in discouraging us, not least as God's people. But this opposition proved ineffective, as we see in verses 4 to 6. The strength of the people's resolve and faith meant that opposition actually spurred them to action and drove them more to prayer. However, the enemy did not go away. They next sought to use every trick in the book, as we might say, and we see this in verses 7 to 14. An unlikely coalition of enemies from all around Jerusalem, you might consult a Bible atlas for the details, now threatened violence. They did this when the people were at the halfway stage of the work, the time when strength was weakened by the work and the rubble clearance had lost something of its glamour. Moreover, initial courage was being undermined by the constant threat and by the war of nerves with which the enemies sought to undermine the people. At length, however, we notice that the people were strengthened by 3 things: the reminder of the importance of the battle and of the character and the power of God, as well as a careful review of their tactics. In other words, and once again, they looked to the Lord and got down to some strategic action. The last section of the chapter, verses 15 to 23, describes a period free from opposition. However, the temptation to seek rest was resisted, and the workload was actually increased. Full advantage was taken of the period of peace as the people watchfully undertook the work.